Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 3, Biopsychology and the Foundations of Neuroscience, Part 5. And we're going to talk about the layers of the brain, and we're going to get into mentioning a few things about some of the structures of the brain, and eventually we're going to talk about the lobes and some of their functions as well. So here we go. When we talk about the brain itself, creatures for the most part with more complex brains essentially have kind of the same what we would call stalk or brain stem. From an evolutionary perspective, this is just part of the brain that has the longest ancestry. So we're talking about things like the spinal cord moving into the brainstem itself, talking a little bit about the reticular formation and the pons and all of that. So as we go along here, do keep that in the back of your mind that there are some things that kind of unite us with other organisms out there. So let's talk about the layers of the brain. We have our brainstem, the cerebrum, and the limbic system. And we're going to start with the brainstem. And to begin with, the brainstem, evolutionary, this is one of the oldest parts of the brain. It controls our vital functions, such as our heart rate, our breathing, and our blood pressure. And when we talk about some of the different parts, we've got to talk a little bit about the medulla. This controls breathing, heart rate, blood pressure. It's kind of our automatic pilot. And if there would ever be trauma to this, it's probably a life or death situation for humans. So we certainly are very concerned if there is an injury or in some cases even tumors and such that impact this region because of the fact that it is vital to our survival. Along with that, we have our pons. This regulates the brain's activity during sleep, and there is a lot of evidence that this is associated with dreaming to a certain degree. The word pons, for the most part, it comes from a Latin word for bridge, and in a sense, it houses a lot of nerve circuits that regulate sleep and our dream cycle. And this connects not only the brainstem to the pons, but it also connects it to the cerebellum, which we're going to talk about. The reticular formation, this arouses the cortex to keep the brain alert and attentive to new stimuli. And in a sense, it's very, very vital when we talk about learning and our education. As far as the shape of it, it is relatively about the diameter of a pencil, kind of the elongated like a pencil. So that's the reason why we say pencil shaped. So for the most part, again, another vital part of the brain that is important when we talk about functions of learning. And then finally, the thalamus, which is located on top. This is the brain's relay station. It sits on top of the brainstem, and for the most part, with a few minor exceptions, about all neural impulses or messages will go into or out of the brain via the thalamus. So in a way, it's kind of like mission control. So without it, would be like a computer without its processor, in a sense. So above that, we have what we call or behind that, we have the cerebellum. This is our another part of the area that kind of is linked to the brainstem. This is known as the little brain. It is attached to the brainstem, and it's definitely involved in the coordinating of movements. There's some research that says that it also is involved with the memory of certain motor movements as well. So, you can have an individual who might have damage to other parts of their brains, but there is in a way, their ability to do certain routine functions is not inhibited. if there is not damage to that part of the brain. So it controls complex movements without consciously thinking about the details. It allows us to keep a series of events in order and is involved with habitual responses. Or when we get into talking about this later on, classical conditioning, this idea that you're kind of looking at things that might sometimes be related to things like reflux and things of that nature. But when you talk about like movements that you consciously don't really think about, that would be like walking and, your balance as far as like when you are walking or riding a bicycle, dance steps, if you're a dancer, all those kind of things kind of go through the cerebellum. So what system do these structures compose of? If we're talking about the hypothalamus, pituitary, amygdala, and the hippocampus. And for the most part, that would be getting into talking about the limbic system. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. The limbic system is the middle layer of the brain. It's involved in emotion and memory. Only mammals have a fully developed limbic system. So if we're talking about reptiles, no. And that might explain why sometimes reptiles have kind of a bad disposition. But needless to say, this gives mammals the capacity for things like emotion and memory. And the parts of that, you have the hippocampus. The hippocampus is, if I run my cursor here, is this like part of the brain that kind of wraps around what would be kind of like the thalamus. For the most part, this is kind of a horse or a seahorse shaped structure. If you think about seahorses and their tails and how that kind of wraps around things, this is involved in establishing long-term memories. For the most part, it does a lot of what we would call the condensing of information into those long-term memories. Sometimes we call that long-term potentiation. It also connects the present with the past and helps us remember location of things that are kind of out there in space. Along with that, you have the amygdala. The amygdala is kind of down here at the base of the hippocampus. It is almond shaped, and that's kind of where the name comes from. If you go into kind of Latin terms, that's kind of the term for that. But needless to say, it's involved in our memory and emotion, and especially when we talk about things like fear and aggression, helps us to remember emotionally charged events. So if you can ever think of a time when you've been very angry, and sometimes it's really easy to remember anger events when you are angry. That's kind of where that's going to be coming out of. It contains pleasure centers linked to give good feelings and accompanies rewarding activities. So when you talk about things that might not necessarily always have a positive spin to it, certainly like drugs, like cocaine and meth and heroin, the amygdala is involved when we talk about those centers because of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And it all kind of works together. And hence, that's the reason why sometimes those kind of drugs have a tendency to be very addictive because of what it does to the brain and what it does to the secretion of those neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine. And then finally, the hypothalamus. This is a structure that serves as the brain's blood testing lab, constantly monitoring the blood to determine the condition of the body, and it plays a role in motivation by sending messages to the higher processing areas in the brain. It hosts some of the pleasure centers, but when you think about it, it has a lot to do with sending messages back to our autonomic nervous system. It's involved in things like hunger, thirst, and even sex drive. And for the most part, it does help us regulate the body's responses during emotional arousal when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. The cerebrum. Cerebrum is the uppermost layer of the brain. It consists of two hemispheres and the fissures. Evolutionary, this is an old part of the brain as well. And when we talk about this, we got to talk about it in terms of some of the different parts here. The cerebral cortex, this is the thin outer layer of the brain. This contains a thin layer of gray matter covering the cerebral hemispheres. That's roughly about a quarter of an inch thick, and it has really a dense layer of cell bodies of neurons. Along with that, it has a wrinkled appearance, and researchers have found that the more wrinkled, the better, because we have found that allows us to have a little more mass or volume to the brain, and allows us to, for the most part, be higher thinking organisms. So it does lead to this awesome mental power that we as humans have. About 2/3 of the brain's mass is kind of within this wrinkly tissue, if you want to call it that. Flattened out, it would probably be over the size of like a regular sized newspaper. Billions of cells, kind of involved in all of this. So for the most part, it's pretty awesome. Along with that, you got to talk about a guy named Franz Joseph Gall. Gall, for the most part, was an Austrian physician going back probably to about the 19th century. Anyway, he believed that specific areas of the brain controlled specific mental functions. Maybe he was onto something, but it kind of got convoluted to a certain degree because it became something known as phrenology. And what he basically tried to do was to map the skull. And he believed that, if you activated certain areas of the skull, you could pretty much manipulate people's personality. Okay, well, for the most part, personality, maybe not so much, but we do know that there are certain areas of the brain that have certain tasks. It might not have anything to do with things like benevolence and friendship and destructiveness, which Gall thought about, but it might have more to do with how we process information, how we do critical thinking, where we process our sensory data, all of that. What we do know is phrenology over time became known as a pseudoscience, but it did kind of open the door to kind of get people thinking about that. There were others. There was Gustav Fritsch and Edward Hitzig. For the most part, these guys also kind of from Europe. They were basically doing a lot of their research in about the 1870s, about the time of the Franco-Prussian Wars between what would be eventually Germany and France. And they did a lot of research on the human brain, particularly of soldiers who, for the most part, had severe brain damage. And needless to say, they were able to find out that if you stimulate certain parts of the brain, particularly in certain lobes, that it did have something to do with how you move your arms and legs, and hence that has led to more research. And that kind of leads us to talking about the lobes. We've got to talk a little bit about the frontal lobe. This is the front portion of the brain. This is the region where we believe that there is some linkage to like movement and thinking, and a lot of that has to do with what is located kind of in the back portion of the frontal lobe, or where it's highlighted below here in red, known as the motor cortex. And this is really what I was mentioning with Fritz and Hitzig back in the Franco-Prussian War. This is what they kind of stumbled upon when they were basically working with patients who had brain damage, and they would activate or they would stimulate parts of the motor cortex. What they found is that individuals had a tendency to move arms and legs and things of that nature. So for the most part, it controls our voluntary movement. And we didn't know that until really kind of the end of the 19th century, kind of on the verge of the 20th century. Along with that, we got to talk about the parietal lobe. This is an area that lies towards the top and the back portions of the brain. This is involved in touch sensation and perceiving spatial relationship, allows us to sense warmth, smoothness, pressure, movement, gentleness. And again, with some of the works of Fritz and Hitzig, they found that, if this area is stimulated, individuals might have felt like there was a certain amount of pressure or warmth or cold that was related to this. Okay. The area between the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, or sometimes known as the sensory cortex, is an area of the central fissure. And that's kind of where these two areas of the brain are kind of divided. In the back, we have the occipital lobe. This is the region of the brain that houses the visual cortex, and it's located in the rear of the brain. This is the home of the primary visual cortex. This is the area of the brain where we process visual information. So if there would happen to be damage to this lobe of the brain, it might impact our ability to see. It's allowing us to construct basically a moving picture of the world around us. So it's kind of like our movie processing center of the brain, if you want to call it that. Finally, the temporal lobe. This is located towards the side, kind of in the region of your ears. This does process sound, but we are finding some information that might conclude that some of our long-term memories may be stored in this portion of the brain. The primary auditory cortex is located within the temporal lobe. It helps us make sense of sound. A specialized area in the left side of the brain is dedicated to the processing of speech sounds, and other parts of the temporal lobe store long-term memories, or the LTMs. Thank you very much.